vivo. Hello, everybody. It's me, David Tucker, and we're here again for Cloud Builder Live. So again, I think we've got a good one today. I really do. So I hope you are excited to dive into Azure, because that's what we're going to be covering. Is we're going to be looking at Azure. We're going to be looking to understand Azure Functions, Azure Bicep, so many things. We'll get into all that in just a minute, but maybe you're here and it's the first time. And so let me just give you a tiny bit of context into why we do what we do. So here it's all about really helping you build solutions in the cloud instead of just knowing about cloud services. You know, I get it. You might have had a certification. Maybe you've taken Azure Foundations, and that's awesome. Now, if you haven't, look back in the chat and you can see that we have a way for you to dive in between now and the end of the year and actually get the resources to take that certification for free, which is awesome with the Cloud Happy thing that's going on right now. But maybe you've done that, but you still don't really know what it's like to truly build something in the cloud. And I get it, right? I talk to a lot of developers that are there. Now, first of all, let me say, before I really get into what we're talking about today, the best episodes we have are the ones where people are just hitting up the chat and they're posting questions. You know, they're getting information out there. So again, I want to encourage you, don't be shy to jump in. That's why we do this live, so that we can get your information with this. Now, we spend a vast majority of the time on this show building, but I always like to spend a little bit of time up front explaining to you what we're building and how this might apply to other contexts besides just the one we're doing. So let's go ahead and let's kind of connect here on what we're doing. So what we're going to be doing with this episode is we're going to be deploying a serverless image analyzer. And so to do this, we're going to use Azure Functions. We're going to use Azure Storage. We're also going to use computer vision, which is a part of cognitive services. And we're going to be doing all of this by managing our infrastructure with Azure Bicep. And for those of you who've kind of hung around for a little while, you know that we did an episode on Azure Bicep, and we'll actually be posting that link later on. So you'll be able to see that as we go throughout once we get to the Azure Bicep portion. So if you're totally brand new to and you're like, hey, I'd love to learn even more, don't worry, we've got you covered on that one too. Now let's hit up just the architecture, because it's important with anything to know what you're building before you dive in and you actually start building it out. So let's just walk through this. So here's a really high level what we're going to be doing. So we're going to start off here. We're going to have this storage account. And inside of this storage account, we're really going to have one container that we're using called images. But within that, we'll be using three kind of different, folders within the storage account to trigger some different things. So let's talk through what that looks like. So first of all, we're going to upload an image, and it's going to go here into this original folder. And we're going to give it some name. It's going to end in JPG because, again, this is all about images for what we're doing. Now, what we're going to do from here is we're going to actually let that be a trigger that's going to go to an Azure function. And what we're going to do here is we're going to actually resize that image. Now, we're doing this for multiple reasons. If you were building out your own, let's say, your own kind of digital asset management solution, you would want to have thumbnails too. Now, we're not actually building out like a UI for this today. We absolutely could build onto that. And if that's something you're interested in seeing in a future episode, for us like hooking into all this and maybe using Azure Static Web Apps to host this, just let me know and we might hook that up for a future episode. But one of the reasons we're doing this is that if we want to actually send this over to cognitive services, we can't have these massive images. There is a size limit. And so because of that, we need to resize. Now, what that's going to do is it's then going to take the output of that and it's going to drop it into another folder within our container. And this is going to go into the thumbnail folder. Now, I'm going to basically follow the same structure. We'll use the same file name. It'll just be in a different folder. Now, we will use that. You're noticing here we're using this kind of event-based approach here tonight. We're going to let that trigger another Azure function. And this one is going to be called Analyze Image. And this is all about sending it over to cognitive services. We'll talk about cognitive services in a minute. And what we're going to do is we're going to let it then go ahead and analyze the image, and then it's going to return back the data in terms of what it's found within that image. And then we're going to take the output of that, so all the data that we've gained from using this, and we're going to output that inside of a JSON file that's going to exist within another folder called data. And so really what's going to happen is what we should be able to do is drop in a single image, and this entire process should work seamlessly, and we should get back both that thumbnail and the data. Now, I realize if you're just starting out here, you might not have had any chance to work with cognitive services, and I totally get that. So if that's you, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look here at just the definition of this. So computer vision, which is a part of cognitive services, according to Microsoft, it uses visual data processing to label content with objects and concepts, extract text, generate image descriptions, moderate content, and understand people's movement in physical spaces. And here's the key: no machine learning experience is required. So really what this is utilizing machine learning, but you don't have to go in and create a custom model to do the machine learning work. You simply get to take advantage of a service that Microsoft is providing where you can go in and say, hey, tell me about this image. You can even tell it, what do you want to know? Do you want it to detect faces? Do you want it to detect objects? Do you want it to generate a description for what the image is just based off of analyzing it with computer vision? So all of those things are possible with this. And so we're going to tie into this pretty cool service to be able to get this information out of it. But as a part of this, we also need to talk a bit about how we're actually going to manage the code here, because we're going to be doing a couple of different things. So first of all, we're going to talk about the infrastructure. So the infrastructure that we create. So this is going to include things like our function app and our service plan and our storage account and that container within our storage account and application insights, like all these things it takes to make this work. We're going to manage that with Azure Bicep. And again, like I mentioned, we have a whole other episode on that if you want to dive in. And this is going to be what we call infrastructure as code. So instead of us going in, we could absolutely create 100% of this just in the portal. But here's the problem. What happens when you want to spin it up in another region, or you want to spin up a production version of this when you've been in dev? Or what happens when you need to be able to send this over to somebody else so they can spin up their own version of it? You need to have a way to define your infrastructure that's not limited just to, hey, go click here in the portal and go click here. That's what we get. And Azure Bicep is kind of a newer approach to infrastructure as code. Instead of just using ARM-based templates that we have, what it actually does is it takes this Bicep file and it will actually convert it to the other template itself. We don't have to worry with it. But the next piece of this is we actually have our code that goes inside of our Azure functions, right? And so we're going to manage that using something called the Azure Functions Core Tools, which is another CLI tool, just like the Azure CLI. And we'll get to what the prerequisites are for all the stuff we're doing here in just a minute. And so with this, we're going to use that to manage that. So that's going to handle things like deploying out that code and the like. Now, here's where I need to give the warning I give most every week. Like, if you spin up infrastructure in your own accounts, you just need to understand you need to hang around to the end today so you know how to shut it down, so that we're able to make sure you don't have any extra charges. Now, the charges here would be considerably less than what we had in previous weeks with Kubernetes. Absolutely. So it's not as big of a concern, but I want to be sure you know that kind of going into what we're doing tonight. So now that we've covered all of that, I do want to let you know that all the code, and I'll reference this again at the end, but all the code is available online. So don't feel like you have to sit here and try to copy stuff down or screenshot stuff. You'll get access. We'll put the link out there in just a minute with everything that we're going to be covering in this episode in a GitHub repository, so you can go try this on your own. That's what I'm hoping you do. I hope you take this and you go build it for yourself. So let's quickly talk about prerequisites, and then I promise the rest of this is 100% about building. So here's what you're going to need. You're going to need a few things. You're going to need to have an Azure subscription. You're going to need to have the Azure CLI, because again, we're going to be using this to actually deploy our Azure Bicep file. So we'll also use it to create a resource group and do some other things. And if you're new in Azure and you're just used to doing stuff in the portal, I promise utilizing the CLI is not nearly as scary as it might seem. You'll learn that it's a much more efficient way to do certain tasks, and you can still absolutely do stuff in the portal. We'll be in the portal tonight too, but we're going to do a lot of the key actions that we're doing within the CLI. And then the next thing you're going to need is another CLI tool called the Azure Functions Core Tools. So this is all about creating new function projects, going in and adding new functions to it, going in and deploying those back out to Azure. This really handles all of that for you. Again, could you do a lot of this within the portal? Absolutely, but trust me, that's a workflow that's not really scalable when you're working within Azure Functions. So here, this is a great tool to enable you to do this. It's not the only one, but I think for what we're doing tonight, it absolutely makes sense. It's the right tool for the job. Okay, we'll take a quick kind of deep breath here because we're getting ready now to dive in and start building. And I know you all are happy about that. Enough of the slides. But one of the things I want to know here, just as we get started, I know some of you here are developers, right? And so if you're developers, I want to know what the first programming language was that you learned. This is going to be critical here. I'm just curious. I'll tell you that for me, I remember being back, like when I was 10, doing BASIC on an Atari 2600. So trust me, you're not going to feel probably older than me in this. So just let me know, shoot it down there in the comments, what your first programming language was. And just on that note, we're going to be utilizing, I see a C#. That's pretty cool. I'll say here as well that I'm going to be utilizing JavaScript tonight. I know I do a lot of weeks. Again, this episode's not about the code per se. It's about how you tie these cloud services together. So if you want to build this out in Python, absolutely, it's totally doable. If you want to build this out in C#, absolutely, totally doable. Like, you can take and apply this. The code here that we're doing is actually fairly simple. Oh, I see somebody that says BASIC on an Apple IIe. That's awesome. I love that. I still remember that the IIe was the first ever real computer that I used back in school. So that's exciting. Okay, we've talked enough, so let me go ahead and get ready here to dive in and start building. So I'm going to go ahead here. I'm going to switch over so you guys can see my screen. And I'm here in the terminal. Now, I just have a clean directory here. There is absolutely nothing in this directory. And we're going to go ahead and start the process of building this out. Now, the one thing I have already done is I've already run AZ login. So I'm already logged into my Azure subscription here within the CLI. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a resource group. This just gives us the ability to group everything we're doing in this episode together under one resource group. So we'll go ahead and let that run. Perfect. Okay, so we've got this resource group up and ready to go. And then the next thing we need to do here is I'm going to go in and I'm going to go ahead and get us ready to create our bicep file. So we'll just say touch main.bicep. And now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to go in here and launch VS Code here within this directory. So this will pull VS Code up. Now, give me just a second. I'm going to zoom into this like I always do so you guys can actually see what I'm doing here. And we'll bring this onto the screen here. Great. And now we have a bicep file. Now, as you can see, absolutely nothing here in the file. We're truly starting from scratch. Now, we're going to move pretty quickly in this though. So let me go ahead and let me take a look at what we're going to do here for this. So to start off with here, we're going to specify an initial parameter here. Now, we spent a lot of time in the previous episode. We already have the link out there you can see in the comments on our episode on Bicep. A parameter gives us a lot of cool capabilities for what we can do, and we can actually change this as we actually execute. We deploy a template. We talk about parameters versus variables. But here, we're just going to say that whatever resource group we use, we're going to leverage that for the location. And by specifying this in a parameter, we can just tell every single resource that we create, hey, we're going to be in that location. Now, the next thing that we need to enter in here is some additional parameters. Now, I've entered in a few additional ones here. We're going to create a suffix here for basically most all the resources we create. We're just going to use the resource group ID and create a unique string out of that. Next, we're going to specify the SKU for our storage account, which we're just going to use locally redundant storage for this, and the SKU that we'll use for computer vision, which we're just going to use the free SKU for this at the moment. So those are just things that we'll need later on. But based off of these parameters, we're also going to need to specify some different variables. Now, again, this is all just kind of pre-work here, because we could just choose to enter in all of this later on when we're creating these resources further down the template. But I just kind of like to group a lot of this stuff together up towards the top. That way we can kind of see it all at a glance. And so we're doing things here like specifying a name for our function app, for our app service plan, for our storage account, so on and so forth, okay? So we haven't created any resources yet in this process. Okay, now the next thing that we need to do is we need to go in and we're actually going to create our first resource. And this one here is going to be cognitive services, and we're going to do computer vision. So you can see here, this is of type, cognitive services, and we specify down here the kind is computer vision, because there's a lot of services in cognitive services besides just computer vision. Now, if you go and try this, this will fail, and I need to explain to you why. So the reason here is Microsoft makes you create your first computer vision service actually in the portal. The reason is because you have to accept kind of the terms and conditions for utilizing computer vision. They're very upfront about that, because there's a lot of different ways people could theoretically utilize the computer vision service and do some things that aren't necessarily good. So they want you to go through and accept those terms. So really quickly, let's just bounce over to the browser. So give me just 1 second here. We'll bounce over here into the terminal. Into the portal. And I'm going to go ahead and go here to cognitive services. And I'm going to go under computer vision. And I'm just going to show you what you would do here. Now, we're not going to create it in the portal. Like I said, we're going to use Bicep for it. I've already accepted these terms and conditions, but all you would need to do is go in here and actually hit create and then walk through the process of creating this. And we could even go through and again, we're going to be taking the free tier here for this. So that's what you would select. You'd enter in all the other details like you normally do. For now though, we'll just head back to home, but I just wanted you to know why this would fail if you tried to do this yourself. So, okay. So now we're back over here. We have our first resource that we've created. Now we need to create another resource, and this is going to be our storage account. So here, if I go in and create the storage account, you can see it's of type storage accounts. And I'm just going to put in a few different values here. Like we're going to specify the SKU that we have included up above as a parameter, the location, and then the specific details. We're going to use a storage v2 here, and we're also specifying that we're going to be in the hot access tier and some other details. So again, not a huge amount to this. And then after this, we're also going to create the container for our storage account. So here we're saying that this is going to be images. That's going to be the name. So we'll see that actually show up in the portal once we deploy this in just a minute. We're going to say that we have public access for the blob, and we're also doing something here that's unique to Bicep. Sorry, I needed to grab a sip of coffee there. We're going to specify here that this depends on the storage account. So for most things that you create in Bicep, it does a good job of knowing, hey, I can't create this until I've created this other thing, and I get the details about it. Sometimes you'll run across resources where it'll fail because it says something hasn't been created, and you'll need to manually go in and actually say, hey, don't create this until this other thing's created first, and that's what we're doing here. We're saying create the storage account first, then you can create the container. Now, the next thing that we're going to add in here is application insights. Now, this is here because we need to be able to get information about our functions as they run. So application insights will give us the ability to get metrics and logs out of our functions, which is going to be an important part of what we do. Now, the next thing that we're going to create is we're going to go in and create our app service plan. We're going to utilize the consumption tier here for this. And then we're going to go through and create our function app. Now, this is our last bit. Please don't get scared by how lengthy this is. All of this makes sense once you know what it's doing. So let me just run through some of this. First of all, here you can see we're actually utilizing our plan ID to give us the value for our server farm ID. This is a great example of how we can reference the properties from one resource when we're creating another. We also have here a lot of app settings that are included. Includes things like defining the storage account we're going to be using. We also need to go in and define things like, again, application insights, and that gives us our instrumentation key. We also need to specify the versions of what we're using. For example, we're using node 16 here. We also need to specify our connection string. We have our computer vision key and endpoint. Now, this one's really critical here for what we're doing. And that is that we need to have both of these bits of data, both the key that gives us access into cognitive services and the endpoint that it needs to call, because we'll need to access this within our Azure functions, okay? Or specifically the one function, analyze image. We won't need it in the other one. So that's really it. That's all of the resources that we need to create for this. So now that we have this in place, we're actually ready to go in and to deploy our bicep file, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to go ahead and bounce back over to the terminal. And here we're in the same directory. Again, if I were just to list this out, you'd see we've got our main.bicep file. That's all that's in here. I'm going to go ahead and start the process of deployment. So that's AZ deployment group create. And then we're going to go through here and specify the resource group that we want to deploy this into and our template file. Now, as a note here, you'll want to have the Bicep extension actually installed for Azure CLI. Now, if you don't have that installed, when you actually go to do this, it'll actually tell you, hey, do you want to install this? And you can say yes. But just as a note, there are some bits of functionality that won't be available to you until you actually install that. So just as a note, in case you run across anything weird, and we've just posted a link in the chat that will help you know what you need to do to be sure you've got that up and running. So that's pretty good. Just in a little bit of time, we've been able to create, in essence, all of the basic infrastructure that we need for this. So I'm going to go ahead and start the process of this deploying. So this will take just a minute. It's going to go through and do some local validation. Once it completes that, it's going to start the process of going through and actually beginning this deployment. And this deployment shouldn't take a huge amount of time. However, since it will take some time, we can go ahead and start the process of talking about what comes next. So let me go ahead and pull things back up here. So what we need to do next, now that we've done this initial deployment, we're getting ready to go verify that, but we want to go through the process of creating our function project. So think of it this way. We're going to have a project that can have multiple functions in it. We're going to be using Node.js in this case, as you saw that as I listed it earlier, but again, you could utilize whatever you want. But what we need to do here is we need to go in and define that project for functions. Then on top of that, we're going to need to go in and create our two functions. We'll first create that resize image function, followed by the analyze image function. And then for each of those, they're going to have some dependencies that we need to install. So we're going to have to walk through that whole process. So let me take a look here. Hey, we are done. Things are going well so far, knock on wood for the demo here. So let me go ahead and I'm going to bring back up the browser. And what we want to do here, if I want to go, for example, and take a look, well, let's just go into resource groups, and you'll see here that we have the resource group that we just created. And you can see here we have our storage account, we have computer vision, we have application insights, all the stuff that we wanted in our function app. All of that's here. So everything's working the way that we need it to. Now I'm going to go ahead and open up this storage account because we're going to need to upload an image here in just a minute. Not yet, because we haven't created anything yet in terms of our functions, but we're here. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to go down. We'll look at containers. You can see here that images, for example, is a container that is available to us. So I'll go ahead and open that up. We'll use that in a minute. So let's go ahead and bounce back over to our terminal. And from here, we can now start the process of creating our function project. So here, I'm going to use func. Now this is the Azure Function Core Tools CLI. We're going to say init, and then we're going to say functions, and we're going to specify here that our worker runtime is JavaScript. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. great. Seems like we have what we need. If I were to open VS Code back up, we can see that indeed we do now have a lot of things here in this folder called functions. So great, that gives us what we need. Now I'm going to bounce back here. We're going to actually change into that functions directory. And what we're going to do next is we're going to create a new function, because even though we created this functions project, we don't have a function yet. That's just creating kind of the base project, the shell that we need. So now I'll go in here and we'll say, oh, we'll change directory into functions. We already did that. But what we will do is we will go in and say that we want to create a new function. The language is JavaScript and the name is going to be resize image. So we'll go ahead and specify that. Now, it's going to ask us here what we want to do in terms of the specific template. Now, I'm going to go ahead and select a value. I'll just select one for Blob Storage Trigger, and that is what we're going to use, but we're going to actually manually configure this utilizing the function.json file. So you'll see that in just a minute. So don't worry about that option too much right now and what that did, because like I said, we're kind of going to override that. So let's go ahead and go back over to VS Code. When we do, what you'll notice here is that we have a resize image directory. And within here, we have function.json and index.js. So the index.js, that's going to be our code. You'll see that in just a minute. And the function.json is what's going to configure our bindings. Now, let's talk for a minute about this. The bindings are one of the great features that we have with Azure Functions. We can specify what initially triggers our function to execute. In our case, that's going to be uploading that image into that originals folder. And then we need to specify what we want to kind of come out of that, which in this case, we're going to say that we want to take the output of our function and we want to store that as the thumbnail in that thumbnails directory. So let's see what it would look like to actually make that happen. But before we do, we need to do one other thing, which is we need to actually install one thing called GIMP. That's going to be what we'll install. It's just a library we're going to use within Node.js that'll give us the ability to resize this image. So it's going to install that. Now note here, we're actually installing this. Our package.json file is actually in the functions project, not in the individual function. So, okay, great. So we have that done. We're in a pretty good spot. So let's go ahead and go back to VS Code. And you'll actually notice here, if I were to go under package.json, you can see that GIMP is now included as a dependency. We're going to go now to our function.json file. So here's how I want to show you what I just talked about, which is how we configure that trigger and then how we can configure the output, right? So what that's going to look like is this. First of all, we've defined a storage connection string here, which is our Azure Web Job Storage. We're going to use that. And probably if you were doing this in your own like large scale application, you would want your function, like all the logistics around your function app, to probably use a different storage container than what you're using for the actual images themselves. But in this case, we're just going to use the same thing for now. It just makes things easier. But we're going to have our blob trigger, and our blob trigger is going to say, hey, if you detect that we upload something into this storage account that utilizes this images / originals / some name.jpg, whatever that name happens to be, we want that to make this function execute. And then we're going to specify here that when we send something out of this function, it's going to create this output thumbnail. So let me show you that here on the screen. So here you can see here's what that blob trigger looks like, that definition. And here you can see that we've specified the path, and this way it'll only fire if it actually has something that shows up in this folder with the .jpg. And then you'll see here with the other, we're going to specify that it's going to go into that thumbnails folder, and it's going to take the same name, and it'll actually do .jpg with that. So, and that is, we can tell this is our output because it says direction out. We're also specifying here that this isn't disabled. We want this to be enabled as soon as we deploy it. So we'll go ahead and save that. Now, we're going to have a huge, massive amount of code to resize this image. Are you ready? There we go. It's 10 lines total. Really not too bad. Nothing to get worked up about. And basically all we're saying here is we want to actually take this original image. This is going to get passed in as the second argument here to this function. And we're saying we want to resize it so that the width is 800. And then you figure out, we'll tell GIMP to figure out the height based off of the current aspect ratio. And then we're going to get a buffer here. So actually just the bits of that resized image. And we're going to utilize this output thumbnail. That's what we called, if you go back here, output thumbnail, that's what we called this output binding. So we're able just to pass the data into that, and then it will take care of saving that into blob storage for us. And if you don't believe me, that's okay, because we're getting ready to test it out, and so we will know if it works. So now that we have all of this in place, now that we have our bindings configured and we have our function code, the next thing that we need to do is we need to go in here under functions in that same directory, and we're going to go ahead and deploy. Now, to deploy this, whoops, already did that. To deploy this, I'm going to need to get one value first. I just want to get the name of the function app that we just deployed. Now, in this case, here's what it's called, right? Image Analyzer. And if you're curious, I could go back and show you here that if we were to go back under resource group, right, we're going to see that it is that function app down there. But I'm just doing this to get access to this because we'll need this in just a minute. So you don't have to worry. You could look this up yourself. I was just trying to include this here. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say that we want to publish this, but I'm going to need to pass in that name. That's why I included this here. So I'm going to copy it. And then here, we're going to actually paste that in. So I'm going to go ahead and hit publish. And this is going to take just a little bit of time here the first time it's actually deploying this, because it's got a lot of things that it needs to do. So this becomes a great spot for us to just take a little bit of a break here for just a minute. And I want to see if there are any questions based off of what we've covered so far. Or also, if you just want to comment on if you've had a chance to utilize Azure Bicep, maybe or have you written any function apps yourself? I'm just curious about all this kind of stuff. So if you have any questions, or if you want to talk about the experience you've had with this, go ahead and drop something into the comments. Also secretly gives me some time to grab some coffee. And I can see here we are in the midst of deploying, so all of that's going well while I'm waiting on you guys to post any comments. Okay, I'm not seeing any comments. That's all good. No problems at all. So let me go ahead and pull this back up so you guys can see it. We've actually completed the deployment. It's getting those triggers ready to go, and we should be ready to test. So I'm going to go ahead and go back here, and we're going to go back to the storage account. If you remember, we kind of left this tab open here. So I'm going to upload, but I want to do something here. I need to specify here where it says upload to folder. We want this to say originals. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select a file. Now, I've got some sample photos that I've already picked out. So I know that's a little bit off screen for you there, but I'm just going to pick one of those, and we will then say upload. So it'll take just a second to upload. And here we can see in our originals directory, here is that image. Now, if I go back up, and we'll give this just a second. Okay, we actually already have our thumbnails directory. Now, I do see a question here on what is the cost for doing each thumbnail? So this is a great question. Here's kind of some important bits. Let me actually pull this up here, and I'm going to get you some more detailed information. So the way that Azure functions work, especially if you're utilizing a consumption plan, is that you just get to pay for what you're actually utilizing here. So if we go in and look here at the consumption plan, let me pull this up now that I've actually got this up so that you guys can see it. You can see here that if we look here at, we have kind of this execution time and total executions. So we can look at the free grant per month, giving us 400,000 gigabytes per second, and then 1 million total executions all happen here with under the free grant per month. So if we're utilizing this within that, you're not going to pay for anything. But if you look at this otherwise, then you can see here that you're still paying a tiny, tiny, minuscule amount. So this is one of the great benefits that comes with serverless. So unlike one of those plans where, unlike setting up a virtual machine where you have to pay for it for the entire time that it's up, here we simply get to pay for the executions we have. And so because of that, we're going to have much lower costs for this type of workload. But again, I'm the first to admit a serverless approach doesn't work for every workload, but for workloads like this has the potential to save you a good deal of money. Okay, nope, I don't need help. Thank you, Microsoft. Much appreciated. Okay, so now that we have that, let's bounce back over here, and we can see here that we do have our thumbnail, right? And so We could go ahead and take a look at these. You can just trust me here that it is indeed 800 pixels because that's what we configured it for. But that really just gets us the first step into this process. We want to have that other function work so that we can work with cognitive services. So to do this, we're going to go ahead and go back over to the terminal. Now, the next step here is that we need to go in and create yet another function. So just like we did before, we're going to say that we want to create a new function and we want to name it Analyze Image. So I'm going to go ahead and hit this just like before. We'll select a value, but we're going to overwrite this ourselves. So now if I come back, you'll see that Analyze Image is also now a function that we have at our disposal. So here we go. We've got function, index.js, all the stuff that we had before. We're just going to have this with a new function. So I'm going to close out these two files, or actually I'll just close out everything that we had before. And what we need to do here is we need to figure out what we need to add in both to our function.json and to our index.js. Now, with this one though, we have more dependencies also that we need to install. So just like before, I'm going to specify npmi, so we're going to install these libraries, and these are all Azure-specific libraries. So Cognitive Services, Computer Vision, MS-REST.js, and then Storage Blob. We're just going to go ahead and save all of those values because these are all things that are required to make it work. Now, if we come back over, if we look under package.json, we can see all those 4 dependencies that we have. And now we're ready to start working with our Analyze Image function. Now to do this, let's first take a look at these bindings because we're going to totally change this out like we did before. Instead of utilizing this default one that's configured here, we're going to go in and specify our own bindings. So for our trigger here, our blob trigger, we're going to specify here that anything that comes in the images/thumbnails and then a name.jpg, we want this to trigger this function to execute. And the output data here, we're going to save as a JSON file here in the data directory. So that's what we're planning to do with this. So I can go ahead and close this, and we're going to open up index.js. Now I will tell you that this function here has a little bit more code, but I'm going to walk you through it so it's hopefully pretty easy to understand, or at least something you can go back and take a look at and understand a bit more what's going on here. So first of all, we're importing a lot of different things here up at the top. So here we're getting our computer vision client, we're getting our API key credentials, and then several things to work with blob storage. Here's how we go in and configure access to our cognitive services account where we're doing computer vision. So we're getting that key and endpoint that we created as a part of the infrastructure. We're then creating our new credentials based on the key that we passed in, and then we're creating an instance of our computer vision client. Now we need to also get access into blob storage, and that's what the next little bit's about. Now I mentioned to you earlier that we can tell computer vision what we want it to look for. In this case, we want it to look for image type, faces, categories, tags, description, and objects. These are all the things we're telling it that we want it to look for. You can go look under the docs and you can see the list of everything that you can include with this. There's quite a few things you can list. Now next, we have here a way that we're just generating, the whole point of this function right here is just to generate a function that gives cognitive services the permission to go in and grab our blob so that it can actually have access to it. And then really when we're doing the work down here, it's just these few lines, right? We're getting that unique link. We're then calling analyze image from our computer vision client. And then we're taking all of that return data and we're going to save it as a JSON file because we're putting that in our output data. And if you remember, if I go back to our function.json file, we're calling our output binding here, output data. So that's where that comes from. So now I can save this. We've got all of this saved and can go back over to the terminal. And now we're going to be ready to deploy yet again. So let's go ahead and do the deployment here. So we're just going to do the same thing as before. Actually, I'm just going to cheat here. I'm just going to move up and we'll do the same thing we did before. There we go. So now this is going to go through that entire process again. And it's going to do the deployment. And again, great point here. Any questions, feel free to dive in and ask those. We're getting ready to kind of test out the full thing and see this working completely. So if you have any questions about anything we've done from beginning to end, it's a great time to be thinking of it and going ahead and be typing it in the chat. Okay, we're uploading the whole deal. It's going to go through the same process of finalizing the deployment and then getting those triggers ready to go. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get ready to work with this over here. Oh, wait. Did it just finish up? Pretty much. It's getting closer. There we go. We're syncing triggers. We are on the home front. Home stretch. That's what I meant to say. Same thing. Okay. Things always take longer when you're waiting on them to finish, especially in a demo. So there you go. There we go. Everything's done. So now if I go back over here, now first of all, you'll notice, I think if I refresh it now, yeah, you can see we already have the data because it actually went through and ran that trigger against things that were already in there. So we could go ahead and look at that. But I just want to, just for fun, I want to run through and do it again. So let's go ahead and do upload. I've got a second image here. So let me go ahead and select that. We'll do image 2. And here, we don't need to specify a folder here because we're already in that folder over here. So we can now just go scroll to the bottom and hit upload. Perfect. So we've got image 2. Now, just so you guys are aware what this image is in terms of image 2, let me pull it up here. It's actually from a vacation we had last year. And so here, this is actually an image from, I've asked this on an episode before. I doubt anybody's going to get this. This is from a U.S. national park. Now, if this is like the great trivia question here, and without approval, I'm going to tell you that I might even be able to get you some swag if you can answer this. I don't know that, I'm fairly certain that I can. We'll figure that out. So if anybody knows what national park this is, if you get it right, just throw it in the comments. We'll find a way to get you something. So, oh, that's a great guess, but no, that's not it, Dan. It's not Zion, although I have some pictures of that too. We could hit those. I'll wait to see if anybody else can come up with one. I'll give it like another 10 seconds. Okay, this one is actually Mesa Verde National Park in southwest Colorado. So this is Native American dwellings that they have that are actually built into the cliffs there. Absolutely gorgeous. Would encourage you to go visit it if you can. It is a gorgeous, gorgeous spot. But it's not a lot of people, not a lot of people go there. So this is the image that we're going to see what it actually detected. So let's go back here. Let's scroll back up. We're going to go to data. We're going to get the JSON file here. And I'm going to go ahead and just say, hey, let's download this. And so I'm going to pull this up here. Give me just a second so that you guys can see it. Okay, hold on here. Let's load this up here where you guys can see it. Okay. So, sorry, I had to get this to open up a slightly different way than I normally would. And I will make this bigger so that you guys can see it. So if we scroll down and we look here at tags, we can see here that it detects that there's a cloud, sky, outdoor, nature, landscape, building, which is kind of true, mountain, arch, natural arch, ground, broken arch, and desert. So it's captured a lot of cool stuff here. We can even see nature and rock, like a group of people walking through a canyon. That's pretty close to what it is. In a lot of ways, that's amazing that it's able to detect all of this just utilizing a machine learning model. But again, we've been able to build this entirely event-based workflow utilizing Azure Functions, utilizing Blob Storage, utilizing cognitive services with computer vision, and we manage all that infrastructure with Azure Bicep. So pretty compelling in terms of what we've been able to do. So this is a question from Dan. It says, does each attribute of computer vision attributes count as a separate request in the 1 million allowed per month? I believe this is actually per call and not per attribute that you request. That is a great question, though. I will work to verify that. I'll post something out on that this week. But yeah, I believe it's per request, not per attribute that you specify. So let me go ahead and minimize that. So now let me dive in here and let's talk about what do we do now. So first of all, I want to remind you that, again, I'm hoping you all go out and actually build this week or a version of this week so that you can test this out yourself. And so earlier we put in the link to we put the link into the GitHub repository, so you can go take a look at that and get all the code that we referenced here. But let's talk about how you actually delete infrastructure, because I never want to leave you in a position where you actually don't know what to do with the stuff you've created as a part of this. So first of all, we could just go here under our resource group and we could go in and say, hey, we want to delete everything, but I want to show you something unique first. Here under computer vision, you're going to need to go in and actually, if you delete this, we're just going to delete it from here. I'm going to say that I want to delete this, yes, but it's not really deleting. It's actually soft deleting at this point. So if I go back to, I'll go here on this. Let's go to Cognitive Services. And we go under Computer Vision. You can see here that if I specify this again and I say, hey, I want to actually manage deleted resources, what we can do is I can actually say, hey, I want to go ahead and purge this. And I want to confirm that I can do that. Now, I will tell you, I've had this for some reason for the last day and a half. This operation has been failing, and I need to submit a support request to see why it's failing. But that's how you actually can go through and purge that. If you're utilizing the free tier here, you're only going to be able to create 2 different projects. And so if you're kind of deleting and creating new ones a couple of times, you might run across some limits, and that's why. So I wanted you to be aware of that. But for the rest of it here, when we want to actually go in and delete this, we can just say that we want to delete our resource group. And here we're going to have to specify the name, which is just CBL Oct 2022. And then I can say, yep, I want to delete. And so by doing this, I mean, theoretically here, we haven't consumed any cost other than, well, really none, because most everything we're doing falls within the free tier. And even if we went beyond that, we would only be literally paying pennies on the dollar in terms of what we're executing here. Now, you do need to actually be able to, I see somebody says here, Terraform destroy. Yes, and we could do the exact same thing with Azure Bicep. So we've created a deployment group there. We could delete it with that as well. I was trying to make it as easy as possible, but you are 100% correct. One of the great benefits of utilizing infrastructure as code, whether it's Terraform, ARM templates, whether you're using Pulumi, whether you're using Bicep, whatever it is you generally have one command to be able to delete everything that you've created utilizing your infrastructure as code. But great comment on that. So this is actually all deleting now. So we've been able to do quite a bit here. And I quickly just want to go back here. Give me just 1 second here. I want us to go back and just take a look at, again, what we've been able to create. And I want you to understand kind of the power that we have with this. So let me go ahead and pull this back up here. So if you remember, we started off by saying that we were going to create something that was event-based, so we could take this, upload into Blob Storage. That would trigger an Azure function that would resize the image, which would then trigger something else, which was our thumbnail going in, which would then trigger our analyze image function. That would all go into computer vision. We'd get it back and we'd be able to export that JSON file. Now, really, again, this is the beginning. If you wanted to create something like a digital asset management tool, you could do this. And here's what's crazy. Like if we even go back a little bit, when we go back a little bit, we could look at, previous tools, years ago that would love to have this capability. And now we're able to do it just with this through cognitive services with computer vision. So another question here is Azure Bicep only for Azure, or can you also manage other cloud providers with it? So it is for Azure. So as a note here, and we did talk about this in the Azure Bicep episode if you want to go look at it some more, but Azure Bicep is just a way to generate ARM templates. Now those are going to be platform specific, kind of like CloudFormation is specific to AWS, right? And so you have those specific ones. You also have third-party ones like Terraform, which you've already mentioned, and also others like Pulumi that can work across different cloud providers. So it kind of depends on what you want to do with your organization, the type of infrastructure that you're building as to which tool makes sense. I tend to gravitate more towards whatever the tool is for the specific cloud platform that I'm working on, and I work across all 3. But I know a lot of organizations that build up infrastructure templates utilizing Terraform and have a great deal of success. And I've built a lot of Terraform myself too. So any of those are good questions. So with all of that said, I think it's been a great episode. Do we have any questions here from anybody? You guys, anything you want to hear more about in upcoming episodes? Anything you're excited to see moving forward? Any of that kind of stuff, feel free to drop it in. We'll take another 30 seconds or so here. I'll grab another swig of coffee. Awesome. Well, let me go ahead. I'll just remind you here again that we have the repository here. Actually, just follow. Hold on just a second here. I think I I actually think I forgot to create the short link like I usually do. So I just put that up on the screen so that you guys could get to it. And then I remembered, oh, wait a minute. I still need to go create that short link. So follow the link we posted earlier, because that will indeed get you there, the link in the chat. And I'll be sure that for those watching after the fact, I remember to go actually create that short link so that you'll be able to get to the GitHub repository. Well, awesome. I have enjoyed going through this episode with you. I think we've covered a lot of fundamental things that are going to help you in your career as you're working to learn to truly build things on Azure. We're going to be back next month. And we're going to be looking at actually a different cloud platform. So just stay tuned. You're going to hear about that here pretty quick in terms of what we're going to be doing for next month. And I see here that Mr. Snorlax says, be interested in learning about TerraTest or testing infrastructure as code. That's a great topic. So let me see what I can work for upcoming months around that, because I think really infrastructure as code is absolutely essential for anybody working in the cloud, and understanding the testing tools around that. That's certainly something that I think that would be valuable. But again, appreciate everybody joining me tonight. Please let me know if you build this yourself. You can connect with me on Twitter at _David Tucker _. You can follow along in the Pluralsight Discord channel. Reach out to me there. There's a lot of great ways to stay connected. But thank you for coming for this episode of Cloud Builder Live from Pluralsight and a Cloud Guru.